And what did you learn at that point in your life? Was it like a decompression? At this point, you had just, as you said, just finished Soil and Green. Were you searching at that point? I mean, to go to a Ouija board, for example, there was something
which I haven't been back to since. I just want to make that clear.
Which you were looking for something, clearly. What stage of your life were you that brought you to the point that you would just leave with a backpack?
There was no question but that I was deeply searching and yearning. I would say that it's that sense of when you're falling in love and it becomes consuming. It was as if I was looking at everything in life through this filter of this seeking and questing, which was unequivocally for spirit and for myself, my truest self in relationship to something bigger. There was no question that implanted in me young was a view that things were big. It was beyond global. My grandfather, being a very global and humanitarian individual who actually worked with Roosevelt post-World War II and knew Gandhi, these were his interests. He had implanted in me a very large sense of life, and I didn't have a sense of rules in a way. Well, this is, my mother did a good job of that later, but essentially he gave me this vast sense of things. So at this point in my life, going to India, and what I discovered at the ashram, I was so thrilled that God was out of the closet. Here was a place where everything was about God. So there was immediately this sense of expansion and freedom, that what my dearest desire was to know God was the theme of existence in this place. So that alone was a very liberating factor, the experience of the ashram. The other thing that occurred there was I had my first real experience of, maybe that's not so, I had those very young, but I had a very strong experience of the Christ sitting on the Ganges and looking at all the Swamis bathe in the Ganges. And for some reason, it was quite close to Christmas. I know what the reason is now. It was very, very close to Christmas. And although the sun was bright and there was no snow, that energy was very, very present. And I would go to what they would call kirtan, very early in the morning, 4:30, where you would go in and chant. And there were all these pictures of the gurus, Shivananda, who had passed away, Chidananda, who ran the ashram, Venkatesananda, Satchidananda, who was as well his disciple. And one morning I went in and there was a Indian man who was a sadhu, which means just a wanderer for God. And in India, you have many different looking people who are swamis, could be very light-skinned, bald, in their saffron robes, or they could be very black and dark with almost dreadlocks. And there was a man who took care of the altar. And he looked like a savage kind of individual. He wore almost no clothes except a little tiny dhoti, which is just for his private parts. And he would come in and he would light the incense and the candles with great reverence. And I often would be the only one in. And on Christmas Day, I went in, I was meditating, and I opened my eyes, and he'd placed a picture of Jesus in front of me. And there was this givingness in that action of saying, this is my Christmas gift to you. I don't think he spoke any English. And later that day, to honor the day, all the gurus came in, and I loved being anonymous. It was not my dearest dream to be noticed at all. It's still a struggle. But then it was just, let me be as hidden as possible. And Chidananda called me forward and asked that I read to them from the Bible. Most of them didn't speak English. And he spoke English. I think he was the only one, except for one other Swami. And I read of the birth of Jesus. And as I was reading, I felt this just sweetness of energy come in. And when I looked up, They were all sitting there in meditation. And again, it was this feeling of mutual regard and respect that was unexpected in my eyes, because I had such reverence for them. And the other experience that was memorable, I've already shared with you. Shall I share it again?
Please.
I so yearned. It was as if I wanted to just be out of my body and just be with God. You know, it was like I was struggling against a sense, so meditation was the way, but I hadn't been taught by anybody meditation. I had been initiated in Maharishi's path, and so I used that mantra that was given at that time.
This is transcendental meditation.
Transcendental meditation,
Okay.
but that had been in 1968. But I hadn't used it much, and I felt I was in this new atmosphere. So I just had this yearning to be, you know, in this oneness. And I woke up one night at 2 a.m, the moon was full, and the monkeys were quiet, walking in the stillness in the Himalayas through the ashram to the tomb of Shivananda. I don't know how long he had been dead, but he was the Sadguru of this, the great guru of this ashram, and greatly reverenced. And it was completely dark. There were no lights. And I remember just sort of throwing myself on his tomb with my arms open and just praying through his grace being opened to the experience more deeply of spirit. And it was such a deep and profound silence, except for the light of the moon. And I heard a rustle, and I turned around, and just literally emerging out of the darkness was this same very dark, dreadlocks, naked man. And he came towards me, and his hands were like this, and I was just like caught in this stillness and shock and a little bit of trepidation. And he came towards me, and he had a look of such sweetness. And he opened his hands before me, and he had a fruit to offer me. And he was the one who also guarded the tomb of Shivananda and would sleep there all night. And he just stood there and looked at me, and I remember seeing his eyes and just this deep communion. And I realized afterwards that this was that moment, you know, that moment of communion in that love of God, and this was his offering in a sweet recognition. And I think that, again, as I'm recalling these thoughts, that the preciousness of the experience was that there was such a love of God there, that anybody who loved God, however odd as I was to him, he certainly was to me, but what we were connected in was the heart and that love.
And this wild man, in a sense, with these
Truly
dreadlocks and craziness, was there a wildness in his eyes, or was there a clarity or peace in his eyes?
Love.
Yeah.
Love and regard and respect.
So you're a month in the ashram, and then you fly back to the United States. I mean, was it culture shock again, or how was that?
Tremendous culture shock. I flew back on New Year's Eve, so I ended up having 2 because it's such a long flight and you pass through the time zones. And I decided I wanted to give myself a little test, because having been something of a star up to this point, there's a lot of wonderful things that are given to you always, just for whatever reason. So I thought it'd be a very nice discipline that not only had I just traveled so spontaneously with so little, but that I would put myself in the middle of a 3-row seat, coach, flying back as an exercise. Oh my. That was really tough. And
because it was crowded? Because
it was
people
crowded.
smelled next to you?
They smoked.
They smoked? Okay.
They could still smoke. And I remember just being crunched in the middle and saying, okay, just chant, you know. And it never occurred to me to change my flight. It just occurred to me to endure. And I remember James Wong Howe is a great cinematographer. He's won any number of Oscars, was a dear friend, as was his wife I've mentioned. So he was a great fan of Cuban cigars. So I stopped in, when I was in Tokyo, I bought a box of Cuban cigars, and I remember all my attention went from chanting my tone to protecting this illegal box of Cuban cigars that I was underneath my knees that felt just terribly risky. But his joy in receiving those cigars was worth the anxiety.